Last week I gave you a definition for the basics, the essential facts or principles of a subject or a skill. That's what it means to have the basics, right? And I shared this with you last week, and some of you stopped me afterwards and told me how much you appreciated it but didn't appreciate it. This idea that no matter how long we know something, no matter how long we do something, no matter how long we're part of someone else's life, it's easy to drift from the basics, from those core principles of what it means to be with that person, to be a father, to be a husband, to be a wife or a son or daughter, right? The longer we do them, the higher the likelihood is that we drift from the basics. And I've had a couple people ask in this last week, hey, like, why the basics? Why are we going back there? I actually think that maybe this type of series will become a regular series for us as a church. Something that you'll see on a regular basis. Because there's a lot, I want to say this carefully, but there's a lot of ways in which the American Christian church has drifted from the core of what it means to follow Jesus. There's a lot of ways that there's been concepts and ideas and thoughts that have drifted into, filtered into the American Christian church that I'm not sure reflect Jesus. And I think that's even possible in the context of our own church, of our own way of following Jesus. And so the only way I know to stay true to what Jesus has called us to do is to hang on to the basics, to remind ourselves of the core principles, the core facts, the truth of why we follow Jesus. And then there's another reason. I showed you this picture last week. Not that one. It's not loading well today. But it was a triangle that had like three parts to it. It's okay, I probably messed something up. Had like three parts to it. The bottom was beliefs. The next one had to do with our values. And then the top portion had to do with our behaviors. And our beliefs inform our values, which dictate our behaviors. And so we have to go back to the basics. We have to go back to the core of what we believe, because those beliefs influence our values, what matters to us, how we spend our time, our money, our energy, and then our behaviors. And so often in the context of the church, we spend an awful lot of time on behaviors and not a whole lot of time on values, not a whole lot of time on core central beliefs. So that's where we're going to spend our time these next few weeks. And I've heard it said that familiarity breeds contempt. That was actually an author that said that probably almost 400 years ago now, that the more familiar we are with something, the more we kind of get annoyed by it. Any married folk in the house that have experienced something like that? Don't put your hands up if you want to have a good afternoon. But the original author said, like, hey, the more familiar we come with it, the more we see its flaws, right? The more we struggle to value it. I think that's true. But there's a statement that I believe more fully reflects what it means to follow Jesus. And that is that familiarity leads to indifference. Yes, familiarity breeds contempt at times, and you kind of see the raw edges of people the more time you spend with them. But I believe in our context for today, familiarity, the more familiar we become with something, the more indifferent we become to it. Let me give you an example, okay? Water. Okay, so plain H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, 3 primary components to water. When was the last time you gave a whole lot of thought to water? When was the last time you thought about just how amazing water is and how incredible it is and how important it is and how much it just like is the very foundation of life? Is that something you guys do on a regular basis? Anybody? No. Let's just be honest. Maybe some of the agricultural families in the context of our community understand this more than we do. But by and large, we walk up to a sink and we turn on the water and we expect it to come out clear and taste good most of the time, and it's not going to kill us, right? I think in some way, shape, or form, the familiarity that we have with water has really led to indifference, especially in the context of this country, right? I'm not here to just make you feel guilty, but there are hundreds of children who die every day because of lack of access to clean water throughout the world. Hundreds, actually 200 per hour, because of children who lack access to clean water. And the last time that you and I thought about that was probably one of our kids was in the shower too long and there was no hot water, right? That was the last time we even considered how important water is. Let me just give you 5 facts that might change your perspective on water, because perhaps we've become indifferent to the importance of water in our lives. Here's the first one. Water can dissolve more substances than any other liquid on the planet, including sulfuric acid. Did you know that? Water, in its properties, given enough time and enough exposure, can dissolve more substances, just the sheer number of substances on this planet, than any other liquid. Water. Some of you have older vehicles, you know what I mean. Breaks down some powerful steel. Water. You ever thought about that? Here's another one. Water regulates the Earth's temperature. Do you know that? Most people think it was like, the sun or the moon or all those kinds of things. Reality is water itself is what regulates the Earth's temperature. The amount of water and where that water lives is what determines our temperature. Where that water lives at any given time. And in fact, 97% of all water on the planet is saline water, water with salt in it. That means less than 3% of the fresh water that's on the planet is actually available to us at any given time. And 2% are in the polar ice caps. So America lives on, the world, the entire earth lives on 1% of the water that's contained on this planet. Because water regulates the Earth's temperature. It also regulates the temperature of the human body, right? When fever spikes, when you're getting hot, what do? Water. God-given, regulated water. H2O. Here's another one. 70% of the human brain is water. Do you know that? 70%. You want to get smarter? Drink more water. I think that's a thing. I'm going to start that slogan. Want to get smarter? Drink more water. 70%. I had no idea till this week. I would have guessed 50, 55. It's around the human body's but between 55 and 60% water. But the brain is actually the most saturated part of our body when it comes to water. 70%. In 1 year, the average American home uses 100,000 gallons of water. 100,000 in 1 year. In fact, it takes about 6,800 gallons of water to grow a day's food for one family of 4. 1 day's food. Over the lifetime of what it took to create that food, 6,800 gallons for one family of 4. How do you feel about water right now? You see, the problem is, like many parts of our lives, familiarity, it breeds indifference. We don't think about it oftentimes till it's too late or until it really hurts. And I believe that's true in our relationship with God. I believe that's true with regards to how we understand the foundations of the world, right? Like last week, the point that we made last week is, and so let me ask this question. In what ways have we grown too familiar and therefore indifferent to the story of how the world itself began? In what ways have we grown up on this notion, all right, God created the world and Adam and Eve messed it up, right? We just kind of take it for granted, a lot of the ways that we take water for granted. And last week, the primary point is that God is the pre-existing creator of all things. And if God doesn't create all things, if God didn't create all things, then we don't owe him anything, right? So this one fact, this core principle, this basic idea is at the foundation of what it means to follow God. That God is the pre-existing creator of all things. And we walk around like, yeah, God created everything. With very little humility, with very little awe left in us. I mean, how is it possible that you can drive 75 miles an hour down the road? I know you guys mostly only go about 5 miles over, and it's only on a 4-lane highway, right? 75 miles an hour down the road, you see a sunset, and it lasts for about 3 seconds. You're like, oh, that's really cool, and you just keep on driving. But the moment a wreck happens, you slam on your brakes, and you just watch as long as you possibly can. Like, what is going on over there? Right? It seems like we're programmed to be attracted to the brokenness, but we miss the beauty of God as our creator. One of the core and foundational principles of what it means to follow God is that God himself is the pre-existing creator of all things. And if he created all things, then we owe him all things. And then I just think we've grown indifferent and apathetic towards the idea of not only God as creator, but the fact that we as a mankind chose to rebel against our creator. Right? Like, think about this. The reality is that an all-powerful, all-knowing, forever existing, fully self-sufficient God decided with his very breath to speak all living things into existence, and then he puts a soul inside of a body made out of dust. And that body that was made out of dust, that was given a soul, said, no thanks, I'm good. Right? It's really what God did. The all-knowing, all-powerful, ever-existing God chose to bring into existence life, not just plants and animals, but human life, souls into existence. And within a very short period of time, we rebelled against our Creator. And let me just tell you out loud, it's not just Adam and Eve, because if it was you and me, we'd have done the same thing. But this is the most important point for us this morning, we as a mankind, we chose to rebel against the creator of all things. And yet we grow numb to that. We look at the problems in the world and we blame God. We look at the problems in our families and we blame God. We look at the problems in our body and we blame God. God didn't actually create those. They're a result of the rebellion of us. Mankind chose to rebel against our Creator. And I know this because of Genesis 2. Here's what I want to do for us this morning. I want to read Genesis 2, portions of it, and Genesis 3 in a different version than I would normally read. Because I think for most of us who've gone to church for long periods of time in our lives, this story has just become a little too familiar and therefore indifferent. And so I picked the Message version this morning. I don't normally preach from this version, but it's got some really neat ways of putting things that make sense. And so I'm going to read from Genesis chapter 2. And as I read from Genesis chapter 2, will you watch for the things that God gave mankind? Can you do that? In Genesis 2, God gives mankind 3 specific things as we read through these few verses together. But would you watch for what God gives to mankind so that we can understand the fullness of our rebellion, okay? This is why I'm kind of setting you up, okay? Because God's given us a gift that we decide to reject. Genesis chapter 2. Can I pray for us before we read God's word? God, this is your word, and it is holy. And we are not. And so we ask that you would make us holy by your word today. Help us to see and hear with new eyes and new ears from your word, we ask. Amen. Genesis 2. From God's holy word, I'm going to read in the Message version, starting at verse 5. At that time, God made earth and heaven. Before any grasses or shrubs had sprouted from the ground, God hadn't yet sent rain on the earth, nor was there anyone around to work the ground. Just in case you were wondering, no one gave God any pointers, right? There was no managers. There was no regulating bodies that told God how to do it. Nor was there anyone around to work the ground. The whole earth was watered by the underground springs. That's kind of cool. All the way up until the point of Noah is what most theologians argue. That rain didn't exist until it rained on Noah. The whole earth was watered by the underground springs. Verse 7, God formed man out of dirt. That's just way too familiar for us. God formed man out of dirt. What have you formed out of dirt? What have you created out of dirt that didn't make your mom mad? God formed humankind out of dirt. And you know why we say what we say at funerals? It's because of this passage, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. From dust we came, and to dust we will return. Dear friends, we become all too familiar with our dirt. We're too apathetic. We're dirt. When was the last time dirt told you what to do? When was the last time that dirt made you all anxious and stressed out, right? Well, some of you are hyper clean freaks, sorry. I understand that. When was the last time that dirt determined your future? According to the Word of God, the Creator of all mankind took dirt. And then he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and that man came alive, a living soul. I've been walking with Jesus for the better part of 40 years. I've been a pastor for 25 of those last 40 years. And I've lost sight of the significance of this one verse, that God took dirt and breathed life. His life. That he put souls inside of lumps of dirt. And we came alive. Verse 8, then God planted a garden in Eden. Guess what? We didn't even plant the garden. God planted the garden in Eden in the east. He put the man that he had just made in it. God made all kinds of trees grow from the ground, trees beautiful to look at and good to eat. The tree of life was in the middle of the garden, and also the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What's God do? He sets the parameters for the world, for the first people, right? He creates the world, he plants the plants, he creates the trees, he brings life from dirt, and then he puts us in the middle of it, right? Verse 15, God set the man down in the Garden of Eden to work the ground and to keep it in order, right? So God set the responsibility, right? He created the garden, he created the man, he put the man in the garden, he said, here's your job. Here's your responsibility to work the ground and keep it in order. Verse 16, God commanded the man, you cannot eat from any tree in the garden. You can eat from any tree in the garden except from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? I love the memes that are on social media right now. You had one job, right? You had one rule. Mankind started out with one rule. I am not good with rules. I've never been good with rules. My kids laugh at me. I'm probably the most rebellious pastor they have ever known. Okay, just so you understand, I'm a messed up dude. But I've never been good at keeping the rules. But there was only one when it all started out. I'd like to think that maybe I would last a little longer, but probably not. One rule. One responsibility, take care of the earth, and one rule, don't eat from this one tree. Think about how simple God made our relationship with him, right? How profoundly simple it was to be a human. But God made the food, God made the trees, God made the water. He didn't even have to water the garden. He just had to make sure the weeds didn't get in it, right? God made it all. And he gave us one rule, that we would not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat from it. For the moment you eat from that tree, I like how Eugene Peterson says it. You're dead. Do-do-do, you're dead. One rule, one responsibility. Verse 18, God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. Oh, okay, all right, wait, stop here for a second. So not only does God create everything that exists, and not only does God breathe his breath of life into a pile of dirt and then take that pile of dirt and give it a purpose to take care of the earth, right? And then he gives it one rule so that he can maintain a relationship with that person. But then he says, you know what? Loneliness isn't good. This is how much God cared about the human condition, that not only gave us life, and not only gave us food, and not only gave us water, not only gave us existence, and not only gave us purpose, but then he gave us companionship, that he gives us relationships. Think about how loving God is in doing that. I mean, God could have just turned us all into robots and be like, okay, this is your field, take care of this one. This is your field, take care of this one, right? But he doesn't. God said, verse 18, it is not good for the man to be alone. I'll make him a helper, a companion. So God formed from the dirt of the ground all the animals of the field and all the birds of the air. How's that make you feel? That we are no better than any other animal. That God took that same dirt. I don't care how high our life form is. At our DNA, we're all dirt, according to God's word. So God formed the dirt of the ground, all the animals of the field, and all the birds of the air, and he brought them to the man to see what he would name them. Can I ask you a question? If you made everything in the world, would you let somebody else name it? I'm serious. If you had the ability to speak into existence, to take dirt and make it alive, and heartbeat and breathing and eat food, right? Like if you had the ability to create every animal that walked the planet, would you take it to anybody else and go, what do you think? What do you want to name it? Platypus? Okay. Aardvark? Can you say that again? Would you let someone else name your creations if you were that God? If you were that powerful? If you had that much authority? Would you walk to anybody else and ask like, what do you think? Should we call that the Allegheny? Right? I mean, think about mankind for generations, right? If someone builds it, what do they name it after? Allentown, Pennsylvania. Guess who built the town? Allen. Pittsburgh, guess who built it? Pitt. No, I mean, for generations, men and women have been naming stuff after themselves because they built it. It's my building, my town, my river, right? But God, you see the humility that God had in that moment. That he creates every living thing. Every bug, every bird, every fish, every mammal, and walks it in front of Adam. He's like, what do you think? What do you want to name it? The humility that God, can you imagine the relationship that God's having with Adam as he's just bringing millions of different types of species in front of Adam and letting Adam name them? Can you imagine the conversation God's having with Adam in that moment? Can you imagine the relationship that's developing, right? Centipede, millipede, weirdopede, right? Like, God and Adam are having this relationship, and God's giving him purpose, and God's giving him value, and God's giving him worth, and God's giving him something to do, and God's giving him permission, and God's giving him authority, right? This is the kind of God that is our creator. Look at all the things that God's giving to mankind. So he brings all the animals, and he brings them before man, what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. That's stunning to me. Is that like, can we just say this, right? Like, this doesn't happen. When we think we've got power, when we think we've got control, when we think we've got authority, we're not going to give it away. But God does. And whatever Adam named it, that's what it was. The man named the cattle, named the birds of the air, the wild animals, but he didn't find a suitable companion. It's all done, and guess what's happening? Adam is lonely. And God recognizes his loneliness. And what's God do? So God put the man into a deep sleep. It's like, hey, take a nap. First anesthesia. Godesthesia. As he slept, God removed one of his ribs and replaced it with flesh. And God then used that rib that he had taken from the man to make woman, and he presented her to that man. Wow. God makes the whole world, every living creature, takes dirt and breathes life in it, gives it a soul, says, here's a purpose, name whatever you want to name, and then God recognizes that man is lonely. And so from his very self, from the very human self that is Adam, God chooses to make a woman. And then the man said, finally, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, name her woman, for she was made from man. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and embraces his wife, and they become one flesh. The two of them, the man and his wife, were naked, and they felt no shame. So what did God give to us at creation? What did God give to mankind? 3 things I think God gave us. 3 very important things that God gave to humankind at creation. The first one is that God gave us himself to love and be loved by. How much love is in that little story I just read you, right? Like that God would care enough about a man to put him in a perfect garden that all he had to do was like take care of it and he had enough to eat. So God met Adam's physical needs. God met Adam's purpose needs. God met his relational needs, right? Like how much love is happening in this very early story of what it means to follow God. In fact, the whole thing is really built out of love. If you were God, would you give humans this much authority and this much love, this much control, knowing that they would do what they were going to do to you eventually? Would you do that? Do you have enough compassion to do that? Most of us, we are only willing to extend love and empathy and compassion to people we're pretty sure they're going to give it back. God could see far enough into the future to know what mankind was going to do with all that God had given him, and yet he still gave it to mankind. God gave himself to love and be loved by, right? This is the foundation, right? When Adam first wakes up, guess who's standing there? God. I've been in the birthing room for all 3 of my children, and it was the most amazing moments, literally, of my entire life. To watch those eyes open and fix on me as a father. But imagine Adam waking up and seeing God face to face. God started out by giving him himself, giving Adam himself to love and be loved by. The story of creation is a love story. The second thing that God gave to mankind, God gave a purpose and specific people to share life with. You see that? God put him in the middle of the garden and said, here's your job. You have a responsibility. You have something to do. You and I all know what happens when we get bored. You and I all know what happens when we don't have a purpose in our lives. So God gave mankind purpose and someone to fulfill that purpose with, right? A relationship with Eve. So God not only gives him himself to love and be loved by, then God gives purpose and worth and meaning to the man, and also gives a companion for him to do it with. And then here's the last thing that God gives. God gives very clear limits. Very clear limits. You can eat of any tree, anywhere in the garden, except for this one. Okay, so for those of you who are maybe developmental psychologists, or maybe you're in education, maybe you're in nursing, you'll know this. Can you see the 3 things that God gave? God gave love, purpose, and relationship, and limits. Do you know that sociologists, psychologists will tell us that in order for a child to thrive, not just survive, but to thrive, these are the 3 primary things that every child needs to thrive. You can't just give a child sun and warmth and food and expect it to live. God gave the very foundational building blocks of what mankind needed to thrive. And here we are thousands of years later, and it's exactly what every child needs to thrive. They need love, they need purpose, they need relationships, and then they need clear limits. They need to know what they can and cannot do, because otherwise they'll hurt themselves. God was the original creator of what it means to make humans thrive. That he gives love, and he gives purpose, and he gives clear limits. And we as parents, thousands of years later, are trying to do the exact same thing. To fill our kids with love, and to fill our kids with purpose, and to fill our kids with healthy relationships, and to set good limits. The creation story is a love story, and this is what God gives to us at creation. What we needed to thrive. Question is, I love how Zach Eswine says it. He says, in the garden that God planted, pleasing God meant nothing more than listening to his word, following him, and gracefully sharing each other's company. But that didn't seem to be enough for them. It just didn't seem to be enough. This list wasn't enough for Adam and Eve to love and be loved by God, to have a purpose and to have each other in relationship, to have clear limits. It wasn't enough. And so what did they do, right? What did mankind do with these gifts from God? What did we as humans decide to do with these things that God gave us to thrive? We rebelled. We said no. We defaulted. You know how I know? Genesis 3. Turn the page. I'm going to read the exact same version again from the Message version. And would you watch for what man does in response to God's gifts? Okay. Genesis chapter 3. The serpent was clever, more clever than any wild animal that God had made. He spoke to the woman, do I understand that God told you not to eat from any tree in the garden? I worked on that voice for today, just so you know. Do I understand? What's he do? Lies to her. He plants like just enough truth and just enough lies to confuse Eve, right? Here we are thousands of years later, and just so you know, the enemy of our souls is doing the exact same thing, okay? But this is where evil first makes his entrance onto the scene, and he asks a question, do I understand that God told you not to eat from any of the tree in the garden, right? Well, it's sort of, but not exactly, right? Verse 2, the woman said to the serpent, not at all. We can eat from the trees in the garden. It's only about the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, don't eat from it, don't even touch it, or you will die. You know what she added? Yeah, don't even touch it. She even added a little bit of extra. Like you could tell she was already probably struggling, like, oh, should I touch that? Right? Like, it's funny how God gives us laws and then we add a whole bunch of extras to it. By the time Jesus came along, how many different laws were added by the Pharisees? Like 300 and some odd laws onto the 10 Commandments, right? Like we as humans, we have this tendency to be like, oh, that's not good enough. Let's add some more laws, right? So here's Eve. Don't eat from it. Don't even touch it or you'll die, right? Part of that's true. Verse 4, the serpent told the woman, you won't die. I'm still trying out that voice. You won't die. God knows that the moment you eat from that tree, you'll see what's really going on. God knows that the moment that you eat from that tree, you will see what's really going on. As humans, we have this like deeply ingrained desire to know and be in control. And he's playing off of that desire to know everything and to be in control. You'll be just like God, knowing everything, ranging all the way from good to evil. And when the woman saw the tree looked like good eating and realized that she would get what she would get out of it, that she'd know everything, she took and ate the fruit and then gave some to her husband and he ate it, right? I don't know about you, but for me personally, this one verse doesn't break my heart the way that it should. I've become altogether too familiar with this story. We know she takes a bite. Why is it always an apple? Can somebody answer me? She takes a bite from the fruit. And in taking that one bite, humankind is separated from their Creator. The biggest separation that's ever happened in the history of the world took place in that moment. that love relationship that God established between man and himself, the purpose that he gave, was shattered in one moment. All the love that God had for us, all that safety and comfort, purpose and hope, limits that God established for us, gone in an instant. Maybe some of you have walked through a moment like this in your own life, where one decision has catastrophic influences on the rest of your life. Jesus, forgive us for breezing past this moment. Jesus, forgive us for our apathy around the brokenness that was brought upon the world in this moment. It's real simple, right? Like we hear the stories forever, right? Like they're in lots of different ways, books, cartoons, right? Like she picks up the apple, she takes a bite. But what happens in that moment, the separation that occurs, the brokenness that is brought upon the world is unparalleled in that moment, literally. And then she took and ate the fruit and gave some to her husband, and then he ate it as well. Verse 7, immediately the two of them did see what's really going on. They saw themselves naked. They sewed fig leaves together as to make shift clothes for themselves. Shame is really what happened that moment. The first time the world ever knew shame. And here we are, generations upon generations later, dealing with shame upon shame upon shame. Shame is ushered into the world. They begin to understand what only God at that moment could understand. Right and wrong, good and bad. They'd only ever known good. So they cover themselves up. Verse 8, when they heard the sound of God strolling in the garden, the evening breeze, the man and his wife hid the trees of the garden. They hid from God. Those very same trees that were meant to give them life became the place that they hid from God, to keep them from life. Hid in the trees of the garden, they hid from God. And God called to the man, hey, where are you? Okay, stop the narrative for just 1 second. Put yourself in God's shoes. You're the creator of the world. You're all-powerful. You're all-existent. You don't need anyone or anything. The one thing that you created just rejected you. Would you respond that way? Like, part of me wonders what the tone in God's voice was. Where are you? Right? Like, is that what God's saying? Or did God say, hey, where are you? Probably for most of my life, I struggled with some authority issues around God. And I heard God say, where are you? Like a lot of times in my life, right? But what I really believe God was saying in that moment, hey, where are you? Where'd you go? Why are you hiding? I don't know where you are in your walk with God right now. I don't know what your own journey looks like. I don't know the pain that you've carried, but I want to give you just a brief moment of hope, brief moment of realization that the God of the universe, who created all things, who spoke life into existence from dust, when he was rejected, he came looking for the very one who rejected him. He came searching for the very one that betrayed him. That's the kind of God that I follow. That's the kind of God that would send his only Son into the world to rescue us from our own sin, from our own pain, from our own ugliness. That's God. A God who comes after the very same people who reject him. Is there anything worse in life than promised love that doesn't get fulfilled? Is there anything more painful in life than love that is promised to you that doesn't get fulfilled? And for those of us who've lived through that pain, and in some way, shape, or form, we've all had people make promises to us around love that we didn't fulfill. You know what our default response is, right? We want to protect, we want to hide, we want to retaliate, we want to get them back, we want to make sure it never happens again, we want to put the walls up, we want to shoot them, whatever we want to do, okay? Don't do that part. But God offers himself to love and be loved by these humans. And they reject him, they rebel against him. And instead of just wiping them out and starting over, I don't know about you, but if I just got it from dust, I would be like, all right, I got more dust, right? I got more dirt I can use. God could have hit the reset button, but he didn't. He came after the very same people that rejected and rebelled against him. And he asked the question, where are you? And dear friend, I believe that God is still asking that question of all of us today. Where are you? I miss you. Why are you hiding? God called to the man, where are you? Verse 10, he said, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid. There, that's where I am. God said, who told you were naked? God knows the answer, friends, just so you know. God knows where they are. God knows where Adam and Eve are existing, right? But he's asking if they're going to be honest with him, if they're going to be real with him, right? He's wondering, hey, are you going to reject me entirely, right? So God knows where they are. God knows why they are where they are. He's really asking to see if they're going to be honest with him from this point forward. God said, who told you you were naked? Did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from? God knew the answer. Verse 12, the man said, woman! How many years later it's still happening? Woman! The woman you gave me as a companion, she gave me fruit from the tree, and yes, I ate it. God said to the woman, what's it that you've done? The serpent seduced me, she said, and I ate it. Shame. Now what comes in? What's the second thing? Blame. Shame, hiding, blame, all within like 9 verses, right? All this stuff that we do to each other now, thousands of years later, all the ways we treat each other horribly, all the things we promise and that we don't follow through on, all the hurt we cause each other, and all the pain it causes, and all the shame it causes, and all the hiding it causes, and all the blame it causes. It all happens right here in just these few verses. And here's the start of it all. Shame and pain and blame and hiding from this one moment. So what's God do? Okay, verse 20, the man known as Adam named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living things. God made leather clothing for Adam and his wife and dressed them, right? So, like, he stopped calling her a woman and actually gave her a name. That's good. It's nice. Call your wife by her name. So he names her Eve. I skipped over a little section where God has this really painful conversation with the man and with the woman and with the serpent. Go back and read that because it's going to sound really familiar to all the stuff that we're living through right now. But this is the net result. What God decides to do is that he sacrifices these same animals that he made to cover them up. He's still providing for their needs. After all the rejection, after all the shame, after all the blame, after all the hiding, God is still providing for their needs. This is the first time anything is killed that we know of in Scripture. God takes an animal that he created, he takes that life from that animal, skins it, and uses that same leather to cover the sins of Adam and Eve. And God said, the man has become like one of us, capable of knowing everything, ranging from good to evil. What if he now should reach out and take fruit from the tree of life and eat it and live forever? Never. This cannot happen. The problem was God had had one rule. That one rule was broken, and there was consequences. Verse 23, so God expelled them from the Garden of Eden and set them to work on the ground, the same dirt out of which they've been made. I love that line. Up until that point, God had been the one that was bringing the garden to life. God had been the one that was watering the garden. God had been the one that was planting the trees. Now one of the consequences is the struggle for survival. Out of the same dirt from which they've been made, he threw them out of the garden and stationed an angel cherubim revolving a sword at the east of it, guarding the path to the tree of life. The consequences of shame and blame and hiding, they come upon mankind. All because, right? What did mankind do with the gifts that God gave him? First thing mankind does, Mankind chose self-love over the love of God. At its core, right? Mankind decided, like, I'm more important than God. Feeling good's more important than honoring God. Making myself feel happy, knowing all the things, it's more important than being loved by God. God gave us himself to love and be loved by, and we just decided to love ourselves instead. Second thing that man does with the gifts that God gives, mankind chooses our plans over God's plans. God had a plan for them to live in a garden for all of eternity and never have to work the ground. Never have to wonder where their meal's going to come from. That they would have a daily face-to-face relationship with God. And mankind chose to reject that plan. To reject God's original purpose. To reject God's original relationships. God had a plan and we chose our own. And the last thing that mankind decided to do with the gifts from God is that we chose to defy our God-given limits, and we're still doing it today. We are still defying the limits that God has for us, trying to be God, trying to make our own plans, trying to choose our own love. God gave us everything we needed to thrive. Everything we needed to thrive. And we chose our own plan. We rebelled against our Creator, all because of sin. And what is sin? Literally, it means to miss the mark. What mark was missed that day? The one rule. There was one rule that defined perfection. To sin is to miss the mark, to do anything less than perfection. And because mankind chose sin over God's plan, the world is riddled with shame and blame and fear and pain, and the consequences are playing out over and over and over again. Here we are thousands of years later, paying the price of that sin. Remember what God gave to mankind. He gave us himself to love, a purpose and specific people to share life with, and clear limits. This was all we needed to thrive. He already gave us the food. He already gave us the water. He already gave us the sunshine. He already gave us the air, right? All the physical things we needed to survive were there, but then not just survive, but to thrive. To love and be loved, to have a purpose, to have people in our lives that bring meaning and worth and value, and to have clear limits. God gave us everything we needed to thrive, and we chose the love of self over the love of God. We chose our plans over God's plans, and we chose to defy our own God-given limits, and we're still doing it today. Because mankind chose rebellion against our Creator. This is one of the core, most basic principles of what it means to follow God. That the shame and blame and pain and hiding that exists in the world is not a result of God, but of us. Because we chose to rebel against our Creator. But I have good news for you. What do? What do we do now? Like, knowing that God gave us, right? God gave us himself to love. God gave us a purpose and specific people to share life with. God gave us clear limits, and knowing that we responded this way, knowing that we chose rebellion, what do? My suggestion is for you to spend some time in these two chapters, Genesis 2 and 3, and would you find yourself in that story? Would you ask yourself where you are in that story? Where God is in that story in your life? And I think there's three questions I'm going to invite you to wrestle with this week. And I wrote these down for myself, but I'll put them up later so you guys can see them again. But three questions. Remembering that God gave us himself to love and be loved by, the question is your life daily oriented towards a moment-by-moment relationship with God? That's how it was meant to be, right? That's how we were created to be, in a moment-by-moment relationship with God. Unbroken. Where we know and be known by God, where we love and be loved by God. Is that happening, right? Is your life more and more being daily oriented towards a moment-by-moment relationship with God? Are you choosing the Creator or are you choosing the created more? Are you choosing to be with the Creator or are you choosing to experience the created? It's that simple. It comes down to a decision, right? Is your life daily oriented towards a moment-by-moment relationship with God? Here's my second question. Are you being faithful to the work that God has created you to do? Remember, God gave a very clear purpose to mankind. And I believe that God has a very clear purpose for all of us. So are you being faithful to the work God has created you to do, and to the select people that he has created you to love? Have you ever noticed there's a very small handful of people in the world that only you can love? And only you can love a certain way. And only you have been handpicked by God to love those people, to be loved by them. Are you remaining faithful to the work that God's called you to, and to that select group of people that he has created you to love? And here's my last question. In what aspect of your life might you be defying your own God-given limitations? What parts of your life are you kind of playing hooky? What parts of your life are you kind of living on the edge? What parts of your existence are you trying to defy the limits that God has given you? You see, mankind chose to rebel against our Creator, but we don't have to stay that way. We don't have to stay in rebellion. Now, this is going to sound like a cliffhanger on a movie, but come back next week. Because God does something amazing in response to our rebellion. And we get to spend some time together to learn what it means to really follow Jesus.